I'm sorry. I didn't know you were starting. Go ahead. You'll start. I'm sorry.
Okay, we'll do it. So 1, 2, 3. Hello and welcome back to the Transfigured Life. I'm Father Jonathan Ivanov here with my co-host Luther Menard, and tonight we have a very, very special guest, a young lady who I've had the honor of hosting at my parish, St. John the Theologian, out here on Long Island 2 years ago for our Lenten retreat. Very well attended, and people are still talking about it. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Dr. Jeannie, I almost want to say you need no introduction. So many people know you through your podcast, your online presence, your retreats, your books, of which you've written several. And it is an honor to have you on the Transfigured Life. Welcome.
Thank you, Father, and thanks for calling me a young lady, because that really isn't true anymore. But I appreciate that. It's a pleasure to be with you and Justin Luther.
Pleasure to be with
Very
you, Dr.
good.
Jeannie.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
Dr.
let's get right into tonight's discussion on the crucifixion of the King of Glory. Dr. Jeannie, I want to start with a question because a lot of people in academia and in apologetics, the not so nice kind that like to attack Christianity, attack the Gospels as unreliable documents, but yet it's often the Gospels are often referred to as eyewitness accounts of the life of our Lord and certainly of the events that took place in those. How accurate are they, and how do they compare to what we see in movies?
Okay. Well, the Gospels are accurate, and one of the things I did in the introduction to this book, I discussed that. I thought it was very important to talk about that, because it is so often that people have ideas about the historicity of the Gospels that aren't true. It's unfortunate, very unfortunate that that even Bible scholars, I think, unfortunately, they're the worst. The Bible scholars are the worst in terms of trying to of undermining the historical accuracy of the Gospels. And I think, I have had, this is something that's bothered me. And one of the things that surprised me so much when I realized that this is really very much a part of the academic life in the field of biblical studies. And they would say, well, we just know more than other people about these things. But actually what has driven this idea that the Gospels are not historically accurate is this Western mentality that everything has to be verified, has to be scientific, this kind of a thing. And if it doesn't make sense to your logical, rational human mind, then it didn't happen. And of course, once they began to recognize that the Gospels are a product of different influences, and there was an oral tradition, but there are also other documents that are, in other words, a person didn't just sit down like Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, sit down and just write it from beginning to end. They're very complex compositions, but that doesn't mean that they're not accurate. They're not historically accurate. So when I was working on my dissertation or my thesis for Harvard Divinity School, which was about Roman law, it was specifically about Roman criminal prosecution in first century in the provinces. This is when I began to read about articles by Roman historians, or they just call them Romanists, people who are experts in the field of ancient Rome. They have their own, we could say, journals, academic journals and things, and they talk about stuff. And they treat as completely credible the accounts of Paul in Acts and what happened with him and how he claimed, how he asked to be sent to Rome. He appealed to Rome. That is the first documented instance in any historical record of a Roman citizen's right to appeal to Caesar. And they never said, oh, well, we don't know if we can accept this because this is written in a religious book and, maybe it never really happened. They just said, oh, we have this document, Acts of the Apostles, where Paul appeals to Caesar, and we know that this was the right of Roman citizens. So I said, wow, why is it that these people who are outside our field are willing to accept the New Testament as a credible historical source, and people who work in the field of New Testament are so quick to dismiss everything, or almost everything as real, except the fact that Jesus actually existed, okay? Other than that, everything else is up for grabs. This didn't happen, and this didn't happen, and this didn't happen. And another reason why that happens is because people in biblical studies, not only are they trained, of course, to be critical, and by critical, that doesn't just mean analytical, it means dismissive of things that, again, they don't think can be supported historically, or there's no evidentiary proof, direct evidentiary proof outside of the New Testament, but also what doesn't seem to make sense to them as what they don't recognize as credible proof. The documents themselves are credible and are historical documents. So it's part of this idea that everything has to be subjected to human reasoning and science, which is ridiculous. And when you're talking about God, unless you don't believe that Jesus Christ is God, then of course, you could question that. But if he is the Son of God, then God works outside of the realm of science. So you can't apply those principles to the Gospels and also historical events. There are so many things that happened in history that were very surprising, but nobody says that never happened, because we can't go back and subject historical events to analysis. Was this predicted? Should it have happened? And so many things happen that are just unexpected. And so history can't be subject to those kinds of standards. So another thing that surprised me, and I've thought about a lot, why are so many Bible scholars so intent on not accepting the Gospels and what they say is truth, is because they don't have the mind of the early church. When Orthodox Bible scholars are not respected, they just aren't, because there are things that we will never say. Well, Jesus came to be baptized, therefore he had sins. That's what a lot of people will say. Okay, this is nonsense, of course. So there are certain stances we will not take because we know that was never the tradition of the church. So, but they dismiss that as kind of narrow-minded traditionalism. But because they reject tradition, they forget that there was a whole community that received these Gospels, and that the people who wrote the Gospels, even if you don't believe it was really Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that's a separate question. These Gospels, nobody disputes, is first century. Now, a lot of people try to push Luke into the second century, but I think Luke is firmly in the first century. Let's say they're all written in the first century. That has always been the norm. Well, they're written within the lifetimes of many people who actually knew Christ, who actually met Christ, who were the children of people who actually met Christ, who were the actual eyewitnesses. But they behave as though either they're a bunch of idiots and they were just gullible. They just wrote these things down. Everybody's going to believe them, which is an insult. It's very arrogant. It's an insult to those who came before. But also, you're forgetting the fact that there were people who could have disputed what was written if it didn't happen. For example, there's a lot of discussion about the census. There was no census the year Jesus was born, therefore this never happened. Well, Luke, who prides himself on being a historian, would he invent a census that never happened? Wouldn't he lose all credibility with all the people? Do you think that the people in the first century knew whether or not there was an actual census that brought Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem? Would they know that or not? Yes, they're going to know that. So if there wasn't a census, he would lose credibility. I'm not even talking about whether or not he's honest or dishonest. Luke is an evangelist, that he would want to be honest, because Bible scholars don't believe that either. Okay, they believe that they were motivated by religious concerns, so they invented things to fit a certain narrative. And I'm telling you that the community that received those gospels, they weren't writing for us 2,000 years from now. They were writing for those communities in the first century, to people who would know whether or not that was true. And believe me, Luke didn't write these things that it was the first time anybody ever heard this. These things were well known in the oral tradition before they were ever written down. He didn't invent them. So people would not pay any attention. The first Christians cared about the historicity of the facts concerning Jesus Christ. It was important to them. So not only would the evangelists be reluctant to write down falsehoods, not only because they didn't believe in it, not only because they didn't need to, because everything was true, but even if you don't accept that, they would lose all credibility in these communities. Why would anybody read this? But there was something more. Indirectly, the Jews verify the historicity of the Gospels. The Jews never disputed the fact that Jesus was a wonder worker. And if you look at it from the opposite perspective, that would have been so easy. People say, oh, Jesus, he never did these things. You know, there was no feeding of the 5,000. People just brought food with them and they kind of sat down and shared it. That's utter nonsense, utter nonsense. Because if Jesus was not well known as a wonder worker, the first century, second century, third century Jewish writings would have said that. They wouldn't wait till the modern age for people to say, oh, Jesus never did any miracles. That would have been the easiest way to discredit him for not being the Messiah, because the Messiah, it was known from the prophecies that the Messiah would give sight to the blind and the deaf would hear and the lame would walk. If Jesus did not do those things, that's the first thing they would have said. But he did do them. And for that reason, that's why they were forced to choose. Well, there's only two places where you can get this kind of power. It either comes from God or it comes from the devil. And so they could not believe that he was from God. So they chose to say that he got his power from the devil. Even that is recorded in the Gospels. What about the historicity of the Gospels in terms of the fact that the Gospels are honest about reporting even the things that were embarrassing? What about the cross? They didn't have to say that Jesus was crucified, even though that was very well known. That was a very shameful thing. They didn't have to include the fact that Peter denied him or that Judas betrayed him. These things were very scandalous. So if the gospel writers did not refrain from reporting things that were embarrassing, how can we accuse them of inventing things that were not true on the other side? You see what I'm trying to say? Because if they were dishonest, they would have omitted the bad things and kept only the claims of miracles. Do you see what I'm trying to say? If they were dishonest, they wouldn't have just had the miracles. They would have also omitted anything that seemed to discredit Jesus in any way. Because that was a big deal that Judas denied him. I mean, Judas betrayed him in the ancient world. I mean, Jesus is not going to some kind of a noble death like Socrates. You know, speaking about Socrates, why does anybody believe anything about Socrates? There's no proof. There's more proof about Jesus than there is about Socrates. There's no real proof even that Abraham ever existed or Moses. Why don't the Jews and other people deny that? But the fact is that every single time, what was happening in biblical studies, which is so fascinating, is that they're beginning to be a little bit more, we could say, you know, open-minded to the fact that some things might be true, although they're kind of going in two directions in that. But they're beginning to realize that the reality is a lot more complicated, a lot more complex. But I think that for many of these people, they're dismissive of the fact that the church is very possible that the living church, the people who were around in the time of Christ, really preserve these stories. And the reason why they are so quick to dismiss that is because almost all of these Bible scholars were never part of a church that understood tradition, that preserved tradition, that knew what that meant, that knew how important that was. The Catholic Church talks about tradition, but they keep changing. They haven't preserved apostolic tradition. Of course, the Protestants reject tradition. So we are the only ones who hold on to these things And to us, we trust tradition because we have experienced it in the church. So you have a situation, for example, I'm sorry this answer is so long,
No, you're great.
but I'm trying to give you kind of a broad picture. In biblical studies today, in the case of the letters of Paul, the majority of New Testament scholars say that Paul did not write all of the books of the Bible, of the letters that are attributed to him in antiquity. And it's so fascinating because you have First Thessalonians that most believe is the oldest book in the New Testament, or certainly that means it's the oldest Christian document in existence. They accept that as genuine. But Second Thessalonians, they don't accept as genuine, primarily for one reason, because Paul seems to say that that Jesus is not coming back just yet because certain things have to happen. The man of lawlessness must appear and sit in the temple and demand to be worshipped as God. So Bible scholars have decided that Paul would never have said that, okay? So they have a very strong opinion about Paul's mind, what he would have said, what he would not have said. So they've taken that letter and put it in the disputed camp. So a lot of people believe Paul did not write it. Okay, now just think about this. We know, and Bible scholars will tell you, that probably the earliest collection of writings that later formed the canon of the New Testament are the epistles of Paul. After he died, and he dies as a martyr, even though he was, a lot of people were saying he shouldn't call himself an apostle during his lifetime because he never knew the earthly Jesus, he is the founder of so many churches. And of course, these are all his spiritual children, and they begin to gather together the letters that he wrote. And there's no systematic, it's not like the Bishop of Rome ordered that everybody gather the letters or anything. It's just that as people traveled, if you were in Corinth, you would say, wow, you have 2 letters from Paul. I'd like to make a copy while I'm here. And when I go back to Thessalonica, I'll send you what we have. You see what I'm trying to say? It was a very disorganized, but kind of casual way that the letters were gathered. This is everybody agrees with this. So we could say by the early 2nd century, there was kind of a corpus of Pauline letters. Now, just think about this. This is why it's so silly how many people will insist that Paul didn't write the 2nd Thessalonians. Now, imagine that you are living in Thessalonica. You're there when Paul establishes the community in the year, 49 or 50 or something like that. Now, you're young. Let's say you're 18. Is there a good chance that you're still going to be alive at the end of the 1st century? Yeah. Okay, if you're 18 or 20 in the year 50, when and by the way, Paul continued to pass through Thessalonica on his travels down to Corinth and back. So people knew Paul, let's say up until, the year 60 or so, when he ends up in Rome and he's in prison and all this. So in the year 60, you're 20 years old. So in 40 years, are you still alive? Of course. It's the year 100, you're still alive. Have you met Paul? Yes. Do you know how many letters Paul wrote to your community or not? Of course you know. They're still there. The originals are probably still there in the Church of Thessalonica. They have custody of them. So when people begin to gather, and not only but you're telling your children, oh, we have these letters of Paul. And people look at them, people read them. I mean, they're important. So the next generation also knows how many letters were written to Thessalonica. Are you following my drift? So along April comes, so in the 2nd century, in the 3rd century, do people know how many letters Paul wrote? Yes, not because somebody gathered them, some anonymous person, but because there's a living community that was established by St. Paul that cherished those letters, that cherished his memory, that talked about what he said, that read those letters, that were still alive. There's a continuity.
Right.
This is what we mean by tradition. And so Bible scholars will say, oh, they just gather them. And this is literally what they say. These letters were not written by Paul, the other ones that are disputed, but maybe within 20 years of Paul's life, Paul's death, the year 85. Why do you just draw that number out of the air? So are you telling me that within 20 years after Paul's death, somebody is writing a forgery and the community of Thessalonica is just going to accept it? No, they would never do
Brilliant.
that, because
Brilliant.
the church was very, very careful to reject apostolic forgeries. We know that there were forgeries. There's a 3 Corinthians, there's a letter to the Laodiceans that the church rejected. People weren't stupid, but they're forgetting that there's a living community that's still there, by the way, that was established by St. Paul, and they knew the truth. And they would have said, no, Second Thessalonians is not genuine. Do you see what I'm trying to say? But if you're living in this world where everything is based on your rational analysis, and you don't come from a tradition, a church that values, and I don't count Catholics here, because Catholics have not preserved apostolic tradition. For them, apostolic tradition is whatever the Pope says. Let's face it, that's what that is, because they're constantly changing. So if you come from a tradition that doesn't accept tradition, okay, then of course you're not even going to think. It never enters their mind to think about the scenario that I just laid out. They just figure, well, somebody wrote this letter, signed Paul's name, and everybody accepted it. Are you kidding me? No. That's so irrational. It's much more irrational than the arguments that they raise about why Paul is not rational to believe that Paul wrote that letter or these other letters. So that's my little, what can I say?
Dr. Jeannie, you snapping right now.
Okay.
I like it. I messed with it. It's good. And actually on that, I owe you, listen, we owe you a great apology. Okay. Cause we actually did an episode a while back on some of the, top books for inquirers and things like that. And somebody actually mentioned in the comments, Dr. Jeannie's book on the Orthodox Phronima, thinking Orthodox.
Orthodox, yeah.
And kind of what you're talking about right now is along the same lines. This is the mindset of the church. This is how the Orthodox think. Everything you're saying about tradition right now, and that book should have been somewhere on the top 5. That's how great that book is. So,
but you can see that the phronima of the Western churches. I understand that people are 100% sincere in really believing this, but that's because they have confidence in their own minds. And the Bible, when we talk about the Bible, this is the product of the church. This is the work of the Holy Spirit. We can't subject it to human analysis in that way and say, well, this, and especially to be so arrogant as to believe that you know everything that's in the mind of Paul. Because the other thing that happens, for example, is that people will take what they think to be the most important letters, and that's for Protestants, it's usually Romans. And of course, Luther did this, Martin Luther did this. If something didn't fit what he thought Paul was saying, they believed that Paul, the most important thing that Paul taught was his justification by faith alone, right, or faith. So they try to force, if the letter doesn't reflect that exactly, they will reject it because it doesn't sound like Paul. Well, was Paul some kind of a one-trick pony? Or although say that Paul, had they forget of the fact that when Paul writes these letters, and we don't have a lot of them, when Paul writes these letters, he's simply responding to problems in the community. Now, Bible scholars know that, but they don't know what Paul said when he catechized these people. So they're taking these things and they're trying to analyze them out of the context of what the early church knew and taught and believed. You understand what I'm saying? Right. So for example, I'll give you another example. And this is going to come up big time next spring when Mel Gibson releases his movie about the resurrection, because apparently he's going to be talking about the descent to Hades. And so people are very confused by 1 Peter, where there are references to the descent. And when I've read articles, because I'm working on the follow-up to the Crucifixion book, and that's a resurrection book. I wish it would be out in the spring, but I'm probably not going to be able to make that deadline. But when you're reading people who are trying to understand what 1 Peter said, just think about this. I'm not ready to explain everything that he said, but he references the descent to Hades, and people are confused by what Peter says. Now, why are they confused? And I never see anybody talk about this. Why are they confused? Because they don't know what his community knows. He's not introducing this doctrine to them for the first time as though they never heard it before. This is already well known. That's why he's not explaining it to them. That's why they're confused, because they're receiving it out of context. The Bible scholars today we are reading First Peter without being a member of the early church that knew the oral tradition behind the descent. You understand what I'm saying?
Right.
So when we try to make sense of something that an apostle says in a way that we ignore the ancient tradition of the church, it gets distorted, because the people who first received those letters, those gospels, received them as members of that church. And they knew much, 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 much more about Jesus Christ than we do today. Way more, because they had the whole oral tradition. And we just have this much that's left in writing.
Well, Dr. Jeannie, let me interrupt for a moment, because you said some very important things I'd like to, Luther and I would like to follow up on. Number one, you mentioned your dissertation was about Roman trials.
That for Harvard it was, yeah.
Yeah, and along this line
Roman criminal procedure, first century in the provinces.
And along the lines of the Gospels as eyewitness accounts, a lot of people may not know that Jesus didn't go through a trial; he went through several.
Yeah.
And plus a meeting with the king. So, he actually had a third.
Yeah, that would have been a trial, but I guess maybe you could count it. I didn't think about that.
What can we learn from those details about those trials? First of all, do historians concede that they are accurate in the way they portrayed justice?
Well, there's just, when it comes to, I would say there were really only 2 trials. I think you're hinting at 4, because you're talking about the appearance before Herod, and Herod wasn't really conducting a trial. So I don't really consider that. And we have no account of what was said. He just wanted to see Jesus do a miracle. He'd heard about Jesus, and Jesus doesn't comply. So he just, has fun with him and sends it back. The other one would have been the appearance before Annas, and Jesus won't answer anything because it's not a trial. Annas is trying to get him to say something incriminating. So that wasn't a trial. So we're left with 2 trials, the Jewish trial and the Roman trial. As far as the Jewish trial goes, there's a lot of discussion and debate. I don't think it will ever be resolved as to how closely they followed Jewish law in conducting that trial. It seems evident that they did in many respects. They wanted it to be something that could be, that could stand, that could hold up. Okay. So for example, we see them asking questions for trying to find 2 witnesses that agree. That was very important in Roman and Jewish law. Caiaphas is running it. Jesus is brought there as a false prophet. Only the Sanhedrin had the power, the authority to try a false prophet. So it seems that and he puts Jesus under oath. That's something that shows that this was a real trial. So although there's some dispute as to whether it was a lawful trial, because it was held in the middle of the night in Caiaphas's house, which kind of suggests that it wasn't a lawful trial. Nonetheless, it seems that the procedure that they were following was considered acceptable. And then what I talk about in the book is that the next day they took him to it doesn't say this, but it's hinted at in the Gospels. Matthew at the very end, I think it's the very first verse of chapter 27. He says, when the morning came, they condemned him to death. And that was the second time. He had already been condemned to death in the middle of the night. So they took him to the chamber of hewn stones, where the Sanhedrin met and officially reported to everybody there who hadn't been there the night before, I suppose, what Jesus said. And they officially condemned him to death. So they made sure that was official. So I do believe that it was followed in many respects in a legal manner, but other things, of course, were illegal. Like I mentioned, you're not supposed to put people on trial in the middle of the night in somebody's house. So as far as the Roman trial goes, this is the thing that is most disputed. That, again, I found so fascinating, that Bible scholars, many of whom if not most of whom, I'm not talking about the people of faith, there's certain traditions, especially in the Protestant traditions, that are much more likely to accept the Gospels as historically accurate. There are definitely Protestant traditions that feel that way. But the ones who don't, the Bible scholars will routinely say that the way Pilate is presented in the Gospels and the trial of Christ does not match what we know about Pilate. Therefore, the Gospel portrayal of Pilate is not accurate. He was not really trying to get Jesus released. That's how the Gospels portray Pilate. Pilate did not want to condemn Jesus to death. And so because we know that he was a very strict, very tough governor, and he had to be, to rule these people in this foreign land, that because they know about him from other historical sources, they say that the Gospels are not accurate. So then the question is that true? Are the Gospels not accurate? Or are the Gospels really presenting the truth of what happened? Is there some reason why Pilate really would be reluctant to crucify Jesus? And I think that, frankly, I don't mean to boast or anything, I have never read any other commentary, but there's thousands of them, so they could be someplace. But the idea that Pilate might really have believed Jesus to possibly be a god and be reluctant to crucify him is so obvious. If you put yourself, if you're not thinking as a 21st century, American, British, Australian, European, with that kind of a mind, and applying it, well, this is what we know about Pilate. Oh, therefore, the Gospels are religious compositions, and they wanted to blame the Jews for the death of Jesus. This is the usual argument. They didn't want the Romans to be responsible for the death of Jesus. That's a stupid argument, okay? Here's why it's a stupid argument. First of all, you have to think about how would Pilate have thought about this. And we know that the Greeks and the Romans believed that God really did come to earth. That never comes to the mind of a modern Bible, commentator, because they're not living in that world. And they're just convinced that how people behave in first century Judea, they can understand it by applying their own mind. Now, I'm being a little bit extreme when I say this, because they will talk about Jewish, seeing things from a Jewish point of view, and they try to incorporate what we know about the culture at the time. But get inside of Pilate's head. Would Pilate have believed that gods actually become human beings? Yes. He would never have questioned that. So if you begin to think like an ancient person, and why are we more able to do that as Orthodox Christians? Because we're tied to the ancient church. We understand that people had a different way of thinking because we have.
By the way, Dr. Jeannie, but by the way, during COVID, when I had time, I read the Iliad and the Odyssey because I had these volumes in my library for about 25 years. And in reading them, I was shocked how much the gods interacted with everybody in Troy, with Odysseus. I mean, the gods were woven all through that story, being real people that humans spoke with. I was very surprised.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And there are plenty of, and I, of course, explained this in the book, that there were plenty of stories in ancient Rome about gods. And if you offended them, you would suffer. I mean, there's so many mythologies about that. So the other thing that's really laughable, if you really think about it, is that modern Bible commentators or modern Bible, scholars will say that the church wanted to have this more a softer portrait of Pilate, so that the Romans would not, be offended by what the gospel writers wrote, and they wanted to pin the blame for Jesus's death on the Jews. That's nonsense, because first of all, Romans would have been very upset if Pilate seemed to be a softie. You know what I'm trying to say? That's not good. They would have been offended if Pilate just said, put him to death. They would have been offended. They would have said, go ahead, Pilate. That's what a Roman governor should do. They were more offended by this portrayal. if he was reluctant, although a Roman would have understood his reluctance. You see what I'm trying to say? So the gospel writers did not change the portrayal of Pilate because to sort of placate the Romans were not killing the early Christians because they were offended that the Christians were blaming the death of Jesus on Pilate or the Romans. That's not why. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So what they say the motivation was could never have been the motivation. Right. So all you have to do is just scratch below the surface and try to understand the reality of the history of the times, and you can see how ludicrous many of these arguments are that are made by Bible scholars who are trying to undermine the historicity of these stories, of these accounts.
Wow. Dr. Jeannie, why did Christ have to suffer? It's a question actually that Father Jonathan and I asked another scholar once. And also, if you could just talk more about the significance of this suffering and what it means for us as Orthodox Christians.
Okay, so it depends on what you mean by have to. All right, so we would have to be careful about the language that we use in theology. I'm extremely adamant that we use the right kind of language in theology.
Sure, can you correct that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we don't ever say that Jesus had to, because that kind of idea really comes very much from the Western mind, in which the person says, Jesus had to die for us. Jesus had to suffer for our sins. And the Orthodox Church has consistently, and of course, we're talking about the ancient church, consistently said that Jesus voluntarily went to the cross, that he willingly died for us. This is the teaching of the ancient church. And this idea that Jesus had to die is very legalistic and was developed in the Middle Ages by Anselm of Canterbury, very famously, who came up with the idea of substitutionary atonement. Now, we can't say it was completely absent in the early church, because some people did sort of use this kind of framework, which was completely roundly rejected by people like St. Gregory the theologian, who decimates that argument. Okay, he's talking about how it is, the early church did not agree that Jesus was compelled to die on the cross, and that instead always emphasized the willingness. And that's why in our prayers, if you pay attention to this, a lot of Catholic prayers about in the Mass or in for Holy Week talk about Jesus as the victim, the sacrificial victim. And even though that is correct on one level, because he did die for us and his death was a sacrifice, we don't use that language. You almost never see that language in the writings of the fathers, because Jesus went on a victim. He orchestrated everything. He could have been arrested earlier because people tried to arrest him. He could have been put to death earlier, but these things did not happen until it was the right time, the kairos. It was the time for him to be crucified. He died on this particular day for a particular reason. Everything was orchestrated by God. This was part of the plan of God. So he did not have to die for us. So that's the first thing that we have to say. So why did he die? Then when we talk to Western Christians about this, that have accepted this idea that somebody had to die to pay the price for our sins, and of course Jesus, the Son of God, had to die for us. When I say, well, he, first of all, that the reason why they say this is because they will assume that God the Father, and actually this is teaching in many of the churches, God would like to forgive us for our sins, the Father, but he couldn't because of justice. That's Catholic teaching, absolutely Catholic teaching, that justice demanded that somebody pay for the sin, because they understand sin as a crime for which somebody has to pay, or a debt that is owed. So somebody has to pay, and because God is also just, they say that God demands that somebody pay, and that's why the Son came to earth and he paid the price. Well, what if there's a presumption there that sin is a crime or a debt that's owed to God, rather than an alienation from God because we turned our backs against God. That's what we say. God never departs from us. God never leaves us. That's what Chrysostom says too. We depart from God. We have incurred spiritual illness, and sin is primarily a spiritual illness as the East understands it, as the early church understood it. So when you say that somebody had to die, first of all, you're misunderstanding what sin is. And secondly, you're placing God under compulsion. Okay, that is that God would, that's the whole idea behind God would like to forgive you, but he can't. God can do anything. God is not under compulsion. That's a theological, it's a very important theological truth. So, and then when I point this out to people, I say the following. There is only, I can think of one verse, and only one verse, that talks about why God the Father sent the Son to the world. And that's a very famous verse, John 3:16. Everybody knows it. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, right? It doesn't say God so loved the world that he demanded the death of the Son. Nothing like that. He gave his Son. He gave his Son willingly. He didn't say, well, he had to, he was compelled to, or anything like this. And the other thing that people say when they object to this kind of analysis is they'll say, but Jesus's death was a sacrifice. Yes, I would say, yes, of course, it's a sacrifice. Jesus died for us. Yes, he died for us. Are any of you parents? If you've been a parent, or all of us have had parents, and most of us have had good parents whom we saw really sacrifice for us. Why did they do it? Because it was compelled? Or did they do it out of love? Did they choose? That's what a sacrifice is. You see, this whole idea of tying sacrifice to something which is demanded or required has distorted the whole idea of Christ's sacrifice. And it's such a sad thing because it's such an impoverished idea of Christ, of the cross, of our salvation. And of course, it leads to this whole distortion of salvation among Protestants. And I totally get it. You have the Catholic Church saying, yes, Jesus died for you. He paid the price. But you see how how faulty this is. They realize that there's something wrong there because you have to do something too. It's not enough that Jesus paid for your sins. You too have to suffer in this life or in purgatory for those sins that you did afterwards. So you have all these other doctrines that the Catholic Church created. And then the Protestants reacting against that will say, no. And they're right to say, no, Jesus did everything for us. Jesus saved us. There's nothing we can do to add to that. They're completely right. But they don't have that idea of any idea about sin other than the crime or death. So they're forced to say you're saved by faith alone. They don't see any other option because of their view of sin. And that's not right either. And it leads to this very impoverished idea. Once you accept Jesus Christ, okay, I'm saved. Now what? There's nothing to do. There's no way to develop a relationship with Christ. I mean, it's sad because they don't see any other way to. I mean, even in the Methodist tradition or Pentecostals, where you have this strong tradition of holiness, they know that there's supposed to be something about sanctification and holiness, but they have no idea how to achieve that because they're so divorced from the early church because they've come out of the Catholic Church. They're totally thinking like Catholics. They are.
Wow.
Because that was already Catholic doctrine for 500 years before the Reformation came along. So they don't have an option. They can't think in any other way. And anyhow, I'm sorry I'm making such long answers to your question.
Oh, well said.
I don't know if that's what you're asking about.
No, that's good. That's good.
Well, Dr. Jeannie, thank you very much. We're at the end of our hour, and we have been more enlightened than we ever have been. This is really, we could go on and on and on for hours, but we've taken up an hour of your time, and
I don't mind if you want to continue. You have your own format. I'm here with you. I'll try to give shorter answers. I know part of the problem, you're not getting through too many questions because I'm giving these long answers, but I'm trying to lay everything out so that
Oh
people.
no, these are wonderful answers. We're hoping to use this episode on the last day. It'll be aired on the last day of Lent, and to use it as a sort of a reflection and an hour of encouragement
Yes.
to read these, to hear these things said before we enter Passion Week and
Yes.
all of that.
Yes. I don't know how many people. I'm just going to show you this. I was very excited. I have a copy of my book there. Oh, here it is. Yes. So here's a book where I explain all of these things, because there's so much to say, and it's in the book. Okay. So I'm not trying to promote my book, except that if you want to know more about these things, all of the details are here and all the documentation. And for me, frankly, the thing that was so fascinating by all of this were the Jewish sources. The Jewish sources that talk about the way the Passover lambs were roasted, the way they were sacrificed, why the temple was destroyed, the corruption of the chief priests. That doesn't come from Christian sources. That's why we don't know about them. The real depth of the connection between the sacrifice or the binding of Isaac and the death of Jesus Christ, this blows your mind. And we as Christians aren't connected to that. The early church was. The early Christians understood all of this. So, but we have lost that because we're so far removed from them historically.
Right.
This is the other thing. I know you're not listening. You don't have Greek parish or father, but this is a translation that was recently done in Greece, in the Greek language of the book. It's not exactly the same cover, but it's a beautiful book. I don't know if it's going to be available for sale in America, but it's available in Greece at stamoulis.gr. That's the publisher. So I was really thrilled about
Dr. Jeannie, we'll put that link, and we'll put the link to this in the comments. Just look at the comments, and you can find out where to buy these. And I hope you do, because it's great reading and it's very edifying. And the more you know, the stronger your faith is going to become. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, thank you again.
Thank you, Father. Thank you very much, Father, and Justin Luther. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
God bless you, Kali.
Thank you. Kali Anastasi. Yes, Kali Anastasi.
A blessed Holy Week to you, Luther, my friend, and to all our viewers. Thank you for tuning in, and we wish you a blessed Holy Week and a blessed Pascha to come.
Amen.
Amen. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.